Welcome to our Sunday School Bible Study time here at Southwest Park Baptist Church. This is our lesson for Sunday, August 14th. It's entitled, God Judges. God holds all people accountable for their sins. This week we've only got one chapter, chapter 17 in 2 Kings, as we're getting down toward the end of our study through 1st and 2nd Kings, and in this week's lesson we come to the end of the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel. And so the 17th chapter of 2nd Kings deals pretty extensively with that. We're focusing on verses 7 through 20, but in the first 6 verses in chapter 17, it kind of sets the stage and tells us some information that we need to know. Over the past couple of weeks, we've mentioned the fact that the Assyrians are beginning to show up in the Bible account. And of course, they are the ones who will finally come in and destroy Israel, the northern kingdom. During the last half of the 8th century BC, around 750, down for 100 or 100 plus years, Assyria became the strongest military power that the world had ever seen, according to many scholars. And they were advanced in their military skills with chariots and iron weapons and those kind of things. So over the next 2 or 3 weeks, we'll, as we study them, we'll see and hear about several of their kings. And the Assyrians apparently kept good records themselves, because many of the things that we study about in the Old Testament scriptures that deal with the Assyrians are confirmed by the Assyrian records themselves. Tiglath-Pileser III became the king in 745 BC, ruled till 727 BC, and he was responsible. He was the first of those Assyrian kings to come into Israel and to invade, and he actually came in and carried off the first of the Israelites to be taken into captivity. Menahem was king of Israel from 743 to 738. It was during that time that Tiglath-Pileser first invaded Israel. Menahem paid him off and bought a little bit of time, but then a short while later, Pekah was the king, and 2 Kings 15 verse 29 tells us that in the days of Pekah, king of Israel, Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, came and took Ijon, Abel, Beth-Maachah, Genoa, Kadesh, Hazor, Gilead, and Galilee, all the land of Naphtali, and he carried them captive to Assyria. And then it tells us that Hoshea, son of Elah, led a conspiracy against Pekah and struck and killed him, and so he reigned in his place in the 20th year of Jotham, the son of Uzziah. He was king in Judah at that time. So Hoshea is the last king of Israel. So this is about 732 BC that he becomes king in Israel. So in chapter 17, as we look at the first couple of verses, it tells us that in the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, Hoshea, son of Elah, became king of Israel and Samaria, and he reigned 9 years, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord, but not as the kings of Israel who were before him. Every king, I believe, that we've looked at in Israel up to this point, it has talked about how they did evil in the sight of the Lord, and they walked in the ways of Jeroboam, who set the standard for evil. But Hoshea gets a little bit of a break when it says, even though he did evil, not as the kings of Israel who were before him. And then verse 3, Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, came up against him, and Hoshea became his vassal and paid him tribute money. Tiglath-Pileser ruled until 727 BC, and Shalmaneser V became king of Assyria in 727, and he ruled till 722. So he had a relatively short reign. But during that period of time, Hoshea and Israel were his vassal, and they paid tribute money to him. Verse 4 tells us that worked until the king of Assyria uncovered a conspiracy by Hoshea, for he had sent messengers to So, king of Egypt, and brought no tribute to the king of Assyria as he had done year by year. Therefore, the king of Assyria, again this is Shalmaneser V, shut him up and bound him in prison. So Hoshea secretly made a treaty with Egypt to enlist their help. The mention of So, S-O, king of Egypt, has been a cause of considerable controversy because there's no king in Egypt that's known as So. Several explanations have been offered. The most logical and compelling, the 24th dynasty in Egypt, which was occurring at this time, the capital of that dynasty was S-A-I-S. And in Hebrew, it's pronounced So. And so if that's the meaning, it would read, he had sent envoys to So, even to the king of Egypt there. Regardless, he tried to make an alliance with Egypt. Warren Wiersbe in his commentary points out that ever since Abraham fled to Egypt to escape a famine and only got himself and his wife into trouble, various Jewish leaders have looked to Egypt for help, and they've been disappointed almost every time. And as he points out, that's a lesson for us today, because we have a tendency to turn to the world for help instead of waiting on the Lord and trusting the Lord. So when Shalmaneser discovered this plot, he took Hoshea prisoner, and he left the throne of Israel empty. Verse 5 tells us, now the king of Assyria went throughout all the land and went up to Samaria and besieged it for 3 years. So sometime around 725 or 724 BC, Shalmaneser started a siege against Samaria, the capital of Israel there. A siege, of course, cut off all traffic into a city, and supplies were kept out. And so the purpose of a siege and the effect of a siege was very often to starve the inhabitants of these fortified cities until they surrendered. A siege of 3 years is a pretty long siege, but it's not unheard of. The city of Tyre, which partly built on an island, was besieged by Babylon for 13 years there. So any kind of siege like this meant terrible suffering. So in the 9th year of Hoshea, verse 6 tells us, the king of Assyria took Samaria and carried Israel away to Assyria and placed them in Halah and by the Habor, the river of Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes. The Babylonian Chronicle, an extra-biblical account, has a record of the conquest of Samaria and credits it to Shalmaneser V. Now, he died in 722 BC while this siege is still going on, and Sargon II became the king. And Sargon II took credit for the capture of Israel, but really Shalmaneser is the king during most of that time. The Babylonian Chronicle records that he carried off 27,290 Israelites there. And so between those who were carried off by Tiglath-Pileser earlier and these, a large segment of the Israelite population was carried off captive and resettled, and these cities that it talks about, these places here, Halah and the river of Gozan, cities of the Medes, it's a widely scattered, and by this time the Assyrian Empire is large and it covers a lot of territory. So these Israelites were deported, and you might ask, well, why would the Assyrians take them and settle them in other parts? But that was a routine for them. They routinely settled conquered peoples in different parts of the Assyrian Empire to prevent revolts and to keep the peace. And so that's what happened here with the 10 tribes of Israel. Up to this point, the narrator has not given us a lot of explicit detail on why Israel was taken into exile here. And beginning in verse 7 here, we're going to get an explanation of why this happened and how Israel failed to honor the covenant that God had made with them. And so the nation that had pledged their allegiance to God, their loyalty, the fact that they would be obediently, had repeatedly disregarded him and went their own way. And they committed every kind of iniquity. And so finally, the Lord had had enough, and the exile here is the result. So let's pick up here with verse 7 and look at verses 7 through 13. For so it was that the children of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of the land of Egypt from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and they had feared other gods, and had walked in the statutes of the nations whom the Lord had cast out from before the children of Israel, and of the kings of Israel, which they had made. Also, the children of Israel secretly did against the Lord their God things that were not right, and they built for themselves high places in all their cities, from watchtower to fortified city. They set up for themselves sacred pillars and wooden images on every high hill and under every green tree. There they burned incense on all the high places, like the nations whom the Lord had carried away from before them. And they did wicked things to provoke the Lord to anger. For they served idols, of which the Lord had said to them, "You shall not do this thing." Yet the Lord testified against Israel and against Judah by all of his prophets, every seer, saying, "Turn from your evil ways. Keep my commandments and my statutes according to all the law which I commanded your fathers, and which I sent to you by my servants, the prophets." So, starting in verse 7 here, the author rehearses all the things that caused the divine punishment. And it begins here with a reminder that it was God and God alone that had brought the Israelites, had released them from their oppression, their bondage in Egypt, and had brought them to the promised land. That deliverance from Egypt was the fundamental redemptive event in Israel's history. They owed their very existence as a nation to this mighty, powerful, gracious act of God. So, their historical foundation essentially was a spiritual one. Having brought Israel from bondage to freedom, God had every right to expect them to be obedient and to walk as befitting a redeemed people who were loyal to Him. The last part of verse 7 says they had feared or they had worshiped other gods. And that was a violation of the most basic obligation of Israel's covenant with the Lord. So they had done the very opposite of what they needed to do, what they were required to do as the Lord's people. They acted against the prohibitions of God. And we see that clearly in the Old Testament record. Exodus 20, verses 2 through 6. God spoke these words saying, I'm the Lord your God. I brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image, any likeness of anything that's in heaven above or that's in the earth beneath or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing mercy to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments. In Leviticus 18, the Lord spoke to Moses saying, speak to the children of Israel and say to them, I'm the Lord your God. According to the doings of the land of Egypt, where you dwelt, you shall not do. And according to the doings of the land of Canaan, where I am bringing you, you shall not do. Nor shall you walk in their ordinances. You shall observe my judgments and keep my ordinances to walk in them. I am the Lord your God. You shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments, which if a man does, he shall live by them. I am the Lord. Down in verse 26, you shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments, and shall not commit any of these abominations, either any of your own nation or any stranger who dwells among you. Chapter 20, you shall therefore keep all my statutes and all my judgments and perform them, that the land where I am bringing you to dwell may not vomit you out. And you shall not walk in the statutes of the nations which I am casting out before you. For they commit all these things, and therefore I abhor them. In Deuteronomy, we see a reiteration of those commandments there. So, what he says here, the people had entered into the worship patterns of these pagan nations that God had driven out of the land. And regrettably, this apostasy had been initiated by Israel's own kings, and then the people had followed them. So the folly of the Israelites is made plain in their worship of the gods that the Lord had defeated. Verse 9 says that the children of Israel secretly did against the Lord their God things that were not right. So how did the Israelites secretly sin? Well, that likely refers to the deception that they pursued through their idolatry. They continued to worship God while at the same time worshiping other gods, like God didn't know what they were doing. The Bible describes people who think they can sin in secret. Psalm 73:11. And they say, how does God know? And is there knowledge in the Most High? Psalm 94:7. Yet they say, the Lord does not see, nor does the God of Jacob understand. Understand, you senseless among the people, and you fools, when will you be wise? He who planted the ear, shall he not hear? He who formed the eye, shall he not see? He who instructs the nations? Shall he not correct? He who teaches man knowledge. The Lord knows the thoughts of man, that they are futile. Isaiah in chapter 5 says, what sorrow for those who drag their sins behind them, with ropes made of lies, who drag wickedness behind them like a cart. They even mock God and say, hurry up and do something. We want to see what you can do. Let the Holy One of Israel carry out his plan. For we want to know what it is. What sorrow for those who say that evil is good and good is evil. That dark is light and light is dark. That bitter is sweet and sweet is bitter. What sorrow for those who are wise in their own eyes and think themselves so clever. So they seem to almost challenge God to discover their sins. But to God, their sinful lives are as futile as their belief that God can't see them. Matters had grown even worse. In verse 10, the external rites had become openly false. Israel's worship included setting up sacred shrines, Asherah poles, the following of pagan incense customs, worshiping at cultic high places, even open idolatry. Verse 11 talks about they burned incense on all the high places like the nations that the Lord had carried away before them. So they worshiped God in places and in a manner that did not conform with what God had instructed. The law of Moses instructed that incense prepared in a specific way that God had instructed was to burn continually in the tabernacle and then later in the temple. The people were not to burn incense to God or to any other deity in private worship. And when they did this, they were acting just like the nations that God had driven out before them. Now, it's easy for us to condemn them, but before we condemn them, before we're quick to condemn them, we should take a moment to evaluate our own lives, because we as believers today face so many temptations to compromise our values and to adopt the world's practices. So we need to be careful that we don't fall into the same trap that the Israelites had fallen into. Verse 12 says, again, they had served idols, of which the Lord had said to them, you shall not do this thing. It's foundational in the commandments that the Lord had given them. Verse 10 mentions the Asherah poles. We know that Baal worship was prevalent in Israel, along with many other pagan gods that had been introduced here. Not only had the Israelites violated the covenant that God had made with them at Mount Sinai, but God had also sent prophets to warn them, and they spurned the words of the prophets that the Lord had sent their way to call them back to the covenant. The Lord testified against Israel and against Judah by all of his prophets, every seer. Prophets and seers here are used kind of interchangeably here. The book of Kings identifies at least 8 different prophets that the Lord had sent to the northern kingdom, and that doesn't include Hosea and Amos, who were writing prophets here. So God had given them ample opportunity. He had sent the warnings through all these prophets and given them every opportunity to turn back to him. Verses 14 through 17. Nevertheless, they would not hear, but stiffened their necks, like the necks of their fathers who did not believe in the Lord their God. And they rejected his statutes and his covenant that he had made with their fathers, and his testimonies which he had testified against them. They followed idols, became idolaters, and went after the nations who were all around them, concerning whom the Lord had charged them that they should not do like them. So they left all the commandments of the Lord their God. made for themselves a molded image and 2 calves, made a wooden image, and worshipped all the host of heaven and served Baal. As their ancestors had done so many times, the Jewish people stiffened their necks and hardened their hearts and refused to obey the Lord. What's it mean to be stiff-necked? Stiff-necked people won't humble themselves by admitting they're wrong and changing their ways. The figures derived from the resistance, the stubborn resistance of an ox that's being placed under a yoke there. And so the Bible uses that phrase a lot, being stiff-necked. Deuteronomy 9:6, therefore understand that the Lord your God is not giving you this good land to possess because of your righteousness, for you are a stiff-necked or stubborn or rebellious people. Deuteronomy 9:13, furthermore the Lord spoke to me saying, I've seen this people, and indeed they are a stiff-necked people. That was on the occasion where he had decided to destroy them and start over with Moses, and Moses prayed for them there. And there are many other places through the Scripture where God describes them as a stiff-necked people. The last phrase in verse 14 says that they didn't trust, they didn't believe in the Lord their God. Because they didn't trust the Lord, they were not loyal to His law. They pursued the Baals and the Asherahs out of the false belief that those idols would provide a satisfaction, would provide them something that was superior to what God had promised them. And they rejected His teaching, His commandments, the covenant that He had made with their ancestors here. They followed idols, become idolaters, and we've already seen that, just like the nations that were around them. And God had specifically warned them about the danger of that. Idols, we know, are merely impotent, man-made images, and those who worship idols deny the Creator who made them, and so they fail to achieve the purpose for which God created them. Verse 16 talks about how they had left the commandments of the Lord their God in exchange for the false religion, the false worship that Jeroboam had set up. For about 200 years now, the Israelites had worshiped those golden calves that were made by Jeroboam, one at Bethel and one at Dan there. And so here he makes mention of that. He also mentions they've worshiped the host of heaven. Some of your translation will say the starry host. So they even were involved in worshiping the stars here. And Moses and Amos both had specifically warned against that. The Babylonians believed they could predict the future based on the positions of the stars and planets. And that kind of worship was prohibited. Verse 17, they even went so far as causing their sons and daughters to pass through the fire. They practiced witchcraft and soothsaying. And they provoked the Lord to anger. Verses 18 through 20. Therefore, the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them from His sight. There was none left but the tribe of Judah alone. Also, Judah did not keep the commandments of the Lord their God, but walked in the statutes of Israel, which they made. And the Lord rejected the descendants of Israel, afflicted them, and delivered them into the hands of plunderers until he had cast them from his sight. The Lord was very angry with Israel. The anger of the Lord's not a very popular subject, and we need to understand the anger of the Lord. That's his holy wrath. It shouldn't be compared with a child's temper tantrum or an explosive burst of anger. The Lord was patient. He was long-suffering toward his people. He made all kinds of provision for them, all kinds of warning to them, but they refused to heed those warnings. So God's wrath is anger motivated by love, and that's anguish. And these developments that we study about today were anguishing for God. It's the anguish of a father who wants the best for his children, but they choose to go a different way, their own way. So it says he removed them from his sight, and there was none left but the tribe of Judah alone. So, again, we need to keep that in perspective, because the scriptures tell us that there were many individuals from these northern tribes that kind of rejected Jeroboam's worship and made their way south to Judah and became part of Judah here. So hope remains for those tribes. And verse 19 is kind of a cautionary word, because over the next couple of weeks we'll continue to study as events unfold in Judah in the years after this. And God intended for this to be a warning for Judah. But notice what it says in verse 19. Judah did not keep the commandments of the Lord their God, but walked in the statutes of Israel. So they didn't heed the warning that they got. And we'll see that clearly as we continue our study. So the Lord rejected all the descendants of Israel, afflicted them, delivered them into the hands of plunderers, the Assyrians, 722 BC, until he had cast them from his sight. And they were, as we go on and read, verse 21 says, for he tore Israel from the house of David, and they made Jeroboam the son of Nebat king. And then Jeroboam drove Israel from following the Lord and made them commit a great sin. That language is graphic there. He tore Israel from the house of David. Remember, we studied about that back in 1 Kings chapter 11. In verse 30, Ahijah, the prophet, took hold of the new garment that was on him, tore it into 12 pieces. And he said to Jeroboam, take for yourself 10 pieces, for thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, behold, I will tear the kingdom out of the hand of Solomon, and will give 10 tribes to you, but he shall have 1 tribe for the sake of my servant David, and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel. It goes ahead and describes how Jeroboam set up his own system of worship. His fear that he would lose the kingdom that God gave him led him to construct this syncretistic religion that ultimately is responsible for their demise here. Jeroboam said in his heart, this is 1 Kings 12, the kingdom may return to the house of David if these people go up to offer sacrifices in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem. The heart of the people will turn back to their Lord, and they will kill me and go back to Rehoboam, king of Judah. Therefore, he made 2 calves of gold and said to the people, it's too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, O Israel, which brought you up from the land of Egypt. And he set one in Bethel, and the other he put in Dan, one on the extreme south of Israel, one in the extreme north of Israel. Now this thing became a sin, for the people went to worship before the one as far as Dan. And he made shrines on the high places, and he made priests from every class of people, not the sons of Levi. So that's the great sin. The children of Israel walked in all the sins of Jeroboam, which he did. They did not depart from him until the Lord removed Israel out of his sight, as he had said by all his servants the prophets. So Israel was carried away from their own land to Assyria, as it is to this day. Verse 24 says, Then the king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, Sepharvaim, placed them in the cities of Samaria instead of the children of Israel, and they took possession of Samaria and dwelt in its cities. Not only did a lot of the Israelites get taken to different parts of Assyria, but the Assyrians brought people in to Israel and settled them there. A lot of that happened during the reign of Sargon II. He ruled Assyria from 722 to 705. But the process continued through the reigns of Sennacherib and Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal, all the way down to 627 BC. This resettlement occurred, particularly during the reign of Esarhaddon from 681 to 669 there. It's interesting as you read on. As they brought these people in and settled, they didn't know anything about worshiping the Lord, and so lions attacked them and were killing them. And so the king of Assyria said, send one of the priests and let him go and let them teach them how to worship the God of the land. And so that happened, but this is a northern priest who's not teaching things that are approved by God. And so every nation continued to make gods of its own, put them in shrines on the high places, which the Samaritans had made, every nation in the cities where they dwell. And it says, they feared the Lord, and from every class they appointed for themselves priests of the high places, who sacrificed for them in the shrines of the high. They feared the Lord, but they served their own gods, according to the rituals of the nations from among whom they were carried out. And so, even though they were trying to worship God, they incorporated all of this other stuff with it. So they were not obedient to what God had said, because he had said, you shall not fear other gods, nor bow down to them, nor serve them, nor sacrifice to them. So they did not obey, verse 40, but they followed their former rituals, and so these nations feared the Lord, yet served their carved images, and their children and their children's children have continued, doing as their fathers did, even to this day. So, to kind of wrap this up, what happened to these 10 tribes? We hear the phrase, the 10 lost tribes of Israel. The Bible never uses that phrase at all. Those 10 northern tribes of Israel, they lost their identity. Some were carried off, other people came in, were intermarried with them, and so that produced the Samaritans. But those 10 lost tribes are not really lost. God knows exactly where they are. And many of them moved to Judah and remained faithful to the Lord. There, 2 Chronicles chapter 11 says, the Levites left their common lands and their possessions and came to Judah and Jerusalem, for Jeroboam and his sons had rejected them from serving as priests. And after the Levites left, those from all the tribes of Israel, such as set their heart to seek the Lord God of Israel, came to Jerusalem to sacrifice to the Lord God of their fathers. The main message of this tragic chapter: false worship leads to corrupt practices. Corrupt practices result in divine condemnation and judgment. Disobedient and compromising leaders, both kings and priests, failed to teach the people the Word of God. And as each new generation came along, they drifted further and further from the Lord. And there came a day when God's anger was displayed against His people, and that was the end of the entity known as Israel, the northern kingdom. What can we learn from this? In their persistent rebellion and disregard for the things of the Lord, the people invited God's anger and wrath. With their failure to obey God and live for Him, they lost their identity as God's people. In their case, that came about as a physical exile from their homeland. Under the new covenant, we worship and relate to God differently than they did. But the principles, they're still the same. As God's people, He expects our loyalty, our allegiance, our obedience to His commands and His purpose for our lives. When we allow ourselves to drift away from Him, we find ourselves consistently and regularly engaging in practices that don't honor Him. We run the risk of losing our identity as God's people, just like we see the Israelites doing here. Come back next week and we'll look at the next couple of chapters. We'll move back to Judah. Hezekiah becomes king, and we'll see what transpires in Judah. Thank you.